As I mentioned in the last video, I talked about ideology, ideological state apparatuses, and repressive state apparatuses. In this video, I'm going to address the concept of cultural hegemony. Hegemony was formulated by a man named Antonio Gramsci, who was a Marxist and wanted to explain why a class revolt hadn't taken place. He saw, as according to Marx, that the economic system, capitalism, created a huge working class, a smaller middle class, and a very small elite ruling class. That capitalism was going through these reoccurring recessions, as we see that we're in today, that we had back in the 1980s, that we had back in the 1930s, that we had back in the 1890s, that there was this continued ebb and flow of good times and bad times. And he saw how the economic system was able to use mythical representations or use ideologies such as free enterprise, free labor, and meritocracy to maintain control over the working class. Now, one of the things that Marx believed in was an idea called historical determinism. Marx and Gramsci both believed that sooner or later the working class would realize the nature of their exploitation and oppression and revolt against the ruling class and take over what would be called the means of production. So in the 1930s, we have the Great Depression, yet no revolt took place. And it baffled Gramsci. And he spent time trying to figure out why. The reasons he came up why there was no revolt by the working class during the Great Depression is that he saw how the ruling elite was able to capture the workers' ideology. How they were able to, in a sense, get the workers to believe what they wanted the workers to believe about the relationship to labor, rather than what was really happening in the relationship to labor. They were able to get the workers to adopt the ideologies of the ruling elite, especially the three I mentioned earlier, the idea of free enterprise, free labor, and meritocracy. Using these ideologies, they used the ISAs, such as schools, media, and popular culture, to transmit these ideologies to the working class. They were able to get the working class to seek consumerism. And they were able to get the working class to embrace individualism. Now, for Gramsci, he goes and explains hegemony in these are very basic, but four key ways. One, hegemony is the ways in which culture can be ruled or dominated by one group of people, whereas systems of controls governs our daily activities and thoughts. And this is important. Rather than these large ideologies such as free enterprise, free labor, and meritocracy, Gramsci was able to realize that hegemony did more than get us to buy into these larger ideologies, but to see how these ideologies, how he was able to get us to see how ideologies affect our daily activities and thoughts. In the very simple definition of ideology, the very simple definition of hegemony is ideological domination, domination through consent. Meaning that there is an ideological domination by the ruling elites. But we give our consent as the working class or as individuals to that domination. The ruling elites have control over it, and we sit there and say, okay, fine, we're going to let you have control. We're going to believe in the ideas that you put forward. The key to hegemony is control without force. In an effective hegemonic society, the RSAs are no longer needed. Only the threat of the RSAs are needed. The ISAs and their ability to construct and transmit ideologies have gained such control over the people of a society that force is no longer needed to maintain control. Hegemony allows us to explain the processes, structures, and institutional involvement where ideologies are constructed, transmitted to the people, how they are practiced by the people, how they are passed on to each other, and how they are passed on to future generations. So let me say those again. The four aspects of hegemony. One is that a culture can be ruled or dominated by one group of people who are able to set up a systems of control that governs our daily activities and thoughts. It is ideological domination through consent. The key to hegemony is control without the use of force, where the ISAs have total control over the thoughts and actions of a society. And hegemony explains the processes, structures, and institutional involvement where ideologies are constructed, transmitted to the people, how they are practiced by the people, and how they are passed on to each other and how they are passed on to future generations. Now, if this is kind of ideological domination, and one of the major ideologies of America is freedom, we wouldn't necessarily give our consent to being dominated, that we think free choice and free will would sit there and tell us, no, we're not going to allow you to control our daily activities and thoughts. So why is consent given? First, consent is given because the ruling elite have a greater advantage over the production and transmission of ideologies. The ruling elite, second, is seen as legitimate and seen as having authority. Third, ideology becomes normal or common sense. It's just the way the world is. Or it just makes sense that that's how things work in the world. And fourth, any opposition to the ruling elite's ideologies and controls is co-opted. If it can't be co-opted, it's invalidated. If it can't be invalidated, it's marginalized. If it can't be marginalized, it's silenced. And if it can't be silenced, it's eliminated. So again, the four main reasons why consent is given is that the ruling elite has greater advantage over the production and transmission of ideologies. The ruling elite is seen as a legitimate authority, a legitimate governing body, and they have authority. They have the knowledge about a certain topic that the rest of us don't have. That ideologies become normal or common sense to us, and that any opposition is eliminated, ultimately will be eliminated. While hegemony is usually framed in the issue of oppression and exploitation of people, I believe it explains the process by which ideologies are constructed and transmitted by any culture who has a ruling elite. Now, these ruling elites could be spiritual, economic, social, political. There could be ruling elites along lines of sexuality, along lines of gender, along lines of class. So you have this ruling elite. And it seems to me that every culture has a set of ruling elites. To me, the key seems to be related to the issue of power. Now, if power is defined and used for domination, hegemony works to oppress. If power is defined and used for cooperation, hegemony works for equality. So again, let me say this. The key to how hegemony works in a society, I believe, It's its relationship to power. If power is defined and used for domination, hegemony works to oppress and exploit. If power is defined and used for cooperation, hegemony works for equality. Another aspect of hegemony we need to understand is that there are multiple hegemonies that seem to always be in conflict with one another, each competing for dominance. For example, we have a type of battle and hegemony in this type of war on terror. We have the so-called idea of democracy and Christianity at odds with what has been called totalitarianism in Muslim religions. So we have two sets of ruling elites constructing two sets of ideology, transmitting these ideologies through the ISAs, and are in competition with one another for control over the global population. We see in terms of gender that you have, in the terms of men, that you have a type of white patriarchy that's in conflict with brown patriarchy, that's often in conflict with black patriarchy. So you have these different groups of men competing for dominance in terms of gender, and all of them seem to be in conflict with the issues of gender when it comes to women, who have another set of ideologies, many of them do, that are trying to maintain or trying to get to a sense of dominance in a society. While there are multiple hegemonies, it is the dominant hegemony, the dominant ruling class, that maintains control over the most of the society. Another aspect of hegemony that's important to understand is what's called the hegemonic cracks. No ideology, no structure, no process, no attempt to control is foolproof, that it covers everything, and that it can do so in such a way as to get every single person to believe the way the ruling elite wants the people to believe. What happens is that the truth of reality, or the truth that's presented in the ideology, doesn't match the lived experience of those people who are being oppressed. For example, the issues of whites being smarter and more intelligent or being a superior race. All blacks didn't believe that. All people of color didn't believe that whites were superior or smarter or more intelligent simply because of the color of their skin. So these type of cracks exist. So while the ruling elite tries to gain total control over society, it's unable to do that because the truth that's presented in the ideologies doesn't always match the lived experiences of those people who are more oppressed in the society. Another aspect of hegemony is to ask the question of why this type of social control takes place. Now we see that we have the repressive state apparatuses, which is an external use of control. There are rewards or consequences for adhering to the RSAs or rejecting or revolting against the RSAs. And there's control that is internal. The idea of the ISAs maintaining control over your thoughts and beliefs. Hegemony is the internal type of control. Internal control derives from the molding of personal beliefs into a replica of the prevailing norms established by the ruling elite. Let me say that again. Internal control derives from the molding of personal beliefs into a replica of the prevailing norms established by the ruling elite. One way we can see this thing, if we take a look at fashion, for example, as I talk about in the article. In most cases, men's fashions rarely exposes the male body in the way the female fashion exposes the woman's body. Men's clothing are generally more concealing. They fit looser and are more comfortable. Women's fashions often reveal the female body, especially those parts of the body society has sexualized, like female breasts. The clothing is often tighter and clings to the body more. Shoes are often uncomfortable, especially high heels. And while there are few, if any, laws outside of school, for example, and dress codes, stating what is not and is not appropriate for students to wear, most people adhere to the dominant norms of fashion without any question or complaint. Now, this does not to say that fashion is necessarily bad, but it is to sit there and say how we react to fashion is how we are controlled by hegemony. Fashion is not simply a style of clothing. It is a style of clothing that has a direct relationship to certain ideologies and certain beliefs about what it is to look professional, what it is to look sexy, what it is to look comfortable, what it is to look nice, what it is to look sloppy, what it is to look unprofessional. So we see fashion as not simply a style, but different fashions adhere to different types of ideologies. And that's an important aspect. This is where I really find hegemony so valuable. It's when I understood the way it has control over our everyday thoughts and activities. Now, if it has so much control, the problem is that is it like many people say, that it's just racism will always be there. People will always be greedy. These kind of conflicts will always happen. Do we just give up? Do we have this fatalism, this fatal approach to society that nothing can be changed? If hegemony has such an ability to control our everyday activities and thoughts, then how can we possibly do anything to act up against it? How can we possibly take control over our own thoughts and actions? Well, Gramsci came up with an idea called counter-hegemonic moves. And counter-hegemonic moves are those acts and beliefs that attempt to, 1, question the dominant ideology, 2, develop ways to subvert the dominant ideology. Now, he breaks these counter-hegemonic moves into 2 areas. One he calls the war of position. The other he calls the war of maneuver. The war of position is a culture war. It is a war where the oppressed seek to change the rhetoric, the language. It is a war that moves to liberate ideologies, especially those ideologies that have a more accurate representation of our relationships to the real world. And it's about taking control over the transmission of these ideologies. In many ways, the war of position is an ideological war, replacing the ideologies that are the mythical representations of our relationship to the real world, and replacing them with those ideologies that are more accurate representation of our relationships to the real world. It seeks to displace oppressive ideologies with more harmonious ones. This idea of the war of position can be summed up in this one idea, that no social revolution can possibly take place without a social consciousness revolution happening first. Let's take, for example, the American Revolution. It wasn't a really true revolution. What it was the power being exchanged from the ruling elite in England and given to the ruling elite in America. Fundamentally, no real social revolution took place. A political and economic revolution took place, but we didn't fundamentally change the structure of our society. It's still very much today structured after the immigrants from England. Now, the second war that he talks about within counter-hegemony is the war of maneuver. That after the war of precision has reached a stage where the rhetoric has been changed, that the ideologies have been replaced, and that the people now have control over the transmission of these ideologies, then the actual insurrection against domination takes place. The elites are stripped of their power. People are assumed control in a democratic, equitable rule that we really do start to achieve and start to adhere to our one of the major beliefs, that we are a government by the people and for the people. That institutions are reconstructed to serve the needs of the common good rather than the needs of the ruling elite. And power is diffused of its ability to dominate. Yet, while all this is taking place, this war of position and these wars of maneuver, hegemony is not going to sit idly by and allow this to happen. Hegemony is what's going to happen is what's called these hegemonic shifts. And it's the way hegemony evolves in order to maintain control. This evolution is a hegemonic shift. So what we see with hegemony is that the process works by which you have at the top of this circle, let's say, the ruling elite. They construct and they transmit the ideologies to the working class. Some of the people in the working class say, wait a second, this doesn't match my lived experiences. It can't be true for me. And that discontent reaches the ears of the ruling elite. Well, that discontent reaches a place of mass mobilization, and the ruling elite starts to sit there and say, wait, we're losing control. But we don't want to have to bring in the RSAs to maintain external control. So they shift a little bit. They get us to sit there and believe that by changing the ideology just a bit, that it will now match their lived experiences. Or they change the system of control in such a way as to allow those people who are more often oppressed greater access to economic, social, and educational resources. But fundamentally, nothing changes. The ruling elite are still in control, and the ruling elite still have control over hegemony in such a way as to control their daily activities and thoughts. So again, the process of hegemony is that the ruling elites construct and transmit an ideology. Members of the society realize the myth and the falseness of that ideology. They begin to question the ideology. The complaints from these people threatens the ruling elite's power. The ruling elite shift just enough to make it look like things have changed, but fundamentally or foundationally nothing has changed. And the example I use in the article is the movie Remember the Titans. Now, Remember the Titans was a movie set in the early 1970s about a football team or a high school that desegregated. And you now have a football team that's going to have black and white players who at the beginning of the movie are at odds with one another. They're fighting each other. And you see these ideas of power and control taking place. Well, by the end of the movie, and this is the main message of the movie, is that racial equality, treating people equally, can occur. And by the end of the film, most of, or if not all the animosity or racial animosity and conflict that was occurring in the beginning of the movie have been solved by the end of the movie. In fact, in the end, the daughter of one of the coaches does this long speech about how we've been able to overcome these differences, overcome these problems. Well, I sit there and say that's a hegemonic shift. Because it's my belief that, remember, the Titans, it's not about racial equality, but it's a way of reinforcing white supremacy. In the film, the only time the black players are accepted by the white population of the town is when they serve the needs of the white population by producing a winning football team. Then and only then are the black players accepted by the community. In addition, as this team begins to win and moves towards the undefeated season, except for one clip, one scene at the very beginning of the movie, we never see how this affects the black population. We never see what kind of pride occurs within the black population, because the black population's needs are not relevant in this film. Only the white population needs are relevant. So we see that, remember the Titans as this kind of idea of racial harmony, but it's really about white supremacy maintaining its dominance, because it maintains this master-servant consciousness, master-servant way of whites and blacks acting, where blacks must always serve the needs of whites. It's a belief that was instituted in slavery, and I believe it's still very much a part of how we operate racially in our society today. That the only time blacks or people of color are accepted in our society is when they serve the needs of whites, when they adhere to the beliefs of whites, when they sit there and agree with the ideologies or the perspectives of whites. That if people of color sit there and say, we don't want to buy into these things, they're labeled troublemakers, and they're given all kinds of problems. So we have these kind of shifts that take place where we get to see on the surface that we think something has changed, but fundamentally, nothing has really changed. The last thing in this idea of change is the idea of these contradictions. Gramsci made it really clear that we have internalized these dominant ideologies in such a way that while we often talk the talk, like we do in Remember the Titans, we don't always walk the walk. That there are these times when our beliefs are challenged by our actions. That I can sit here and say that as a man, I've grown to a point where I don't think I'm sexist any longer, and I can talk about women's equality. But there are those moments when I maintain or exercise my male power, and most of the time without really realizing it. So this, in a sense, moves us towards the end and the idea of hegemony. Why hegemony is important is because everything that we know about race in our society is constructed and controlled through hegemony. The final comment I want to make is that Gramsci doesn't tell us that all ideologies are oppressive. What Gramsci allows us to do is to use hegemony in a way that allows us to examine all ideologies to determine the extent of their oppression, if there is any oppression at all. And it must be noted that hegemony is relentless. It works 24/7. It is constantly moving and it's constantly evolving. The hegemonic shifts are constantly at work in order to maintain the control by the ruling elites. So we see in hegemony this idea at the end, and let me go back over these points, is that hegemony, in this very basic or simple definition, is ideological domination, domination by consent. That we give our consent because of the idea of who has power to control and transmit the ideologies, who is seen as a legitimate authority or has knowledge about these issues. Ideology becomes normal and common sense. And hegemony ultimately eliminates any opposition. that there are these hegemonic cracks, these gaps in the ideology that don't match the lived experience, or the ideology doesn't match the lived experiences of the people. There are these counter-hegemonic moves, these ways to subvert hegemony. Hegemony reacts with these hegemonic shifts. That we all have these kind of contradictions where we're able to talk and not always able to walk because we so deeply internalize these ideologies constructed by the ruling elites. And that not all ideologies are oppressive, but hegemony allows us to examine all ideologies to determine the extent of the repression, if there is any. And hegemony works 24/7 to maintain its control over our society.